Alexandria had fallen. The once mighty Egyptian empire, proud and ancient, lay in ruins. Inside a dimly lit royal tomb, surrounded by glittering treasures now rendered meaningless, Cleopatra sat beside the blood-soaked body of the only man she had loved with such passion, Mark Antony. His breathing had stopped. His sword lay discarded, stained with the evidence of his final decision. Believing she had taken her own life, Antony had plunged the blade into his chest, unable to imagine a world without her. But Cleopatra was still alive. The letter she had sent was a lie, an act of desperate strategy perhaps, or a final bid to control their fate. When Antony's advisors learned she had survived, they rushed his dying body to her tomb. With trembling hands, Cleopatra cradled him, her cries piercing the silence of a collapsing dynasty. His blood smeared her tunic, her arms, her face. The man who had once shared her dreams of ruling the East now died in her embrace. Grief-stricken and defiant, Cleopatra planned her own dramatic end. She would ignite the tomb, destroying herself, Antony, and the immense wealth surrounding them. A flaming tomb would be their final union, and a lasting curse upon Octavian, the man who had taken everything. But fate had one more interruption in store. Octavian's trusted officer, Gaius Proculeius, had scaled the tomb's window, capturing Cleopatra before she could finish what Antony had started. She was allowed to embalm Antony's body and conduct a proper burial. But after that, the queen the world once feared and admired seemed to disappear. Now a prisoner, some say in her own tomb, others claim it was her palace, Cleopatra shed her royal robes for a simple tunic. Her jewels were gone. Her throne was gone. But her fire remained. When Octavian demanded an audience, she stood tall, blood still fresh in memory, and met him with fierce pride. No tears, no submission. "I will not be led in a triumph," she told him, one of the few statements ever recorded in her own words. It was a powerful refusal to be paraded through the streets of Rome as a conquered queen, a spectacle in Octavian's victory march. Cleopatra had lost her kingdom, her love, and soon, her life, but not her dignity. She would choose her own ending. Long before she stood at the center of a collapsing empire, Cleopatra was a girl born into chaos and brilliance. She entered the world in 69 BC as a princess of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a ruling house of Greek origin that had reigned over Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Though they wore the crowns of the pharaohs, Cleopatra's family was not Egyptian by blood. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's trusted generals who had seized Egypt after Alexander's death and proclaimed himself king in 305 BC. The Egypt Cleopatra knew was a strange blend of cultures. Greek statues stood alongside ancient pyramids. Temples to Isis echoed beside libraries filled with Homeric texts. In this hybrid world, Cleopatra was groomed not only as royalty, but as an intellectual force. Unlike most of her predecessors, Cleopatra took her role as ruler seriously from the beginning. Her father, Ptolemy the Fiend, may have been a weak king burdened by debt and political instability, but he ensured his daughter had access to the finest education available. Under the guidance of her tutor, Philostratos, Cleopatra studied the works of classical Greek philosophers, mastered the art of public speaking, and learned how to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics. But her greatest weapon wasn't her beauty. It was her mind. She became one of the most learned rulers of her time, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. The legendary Library of Alexandria, the largest and most advanced repository of knowledge in the ancient world, became her intellectual playground. There she pored over texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. What set Cleopatra apart even more was her extraordinary gift for languages. Most of the Ptolemaic rulers refused to speak Egyptian, relying instead on Greek. But Cleopatra defied this pattern. She became fluent in Egyptian, and not just that. She reportedly spoke as many as 9 languages: Koine Greek, her native tongue, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Median, Parthian, Latin, and even the obscure language of the Troglodytes. This made her a unique figure in Mediterranean politics. Cleopatra didn't need translators. She could charm ambassadors and negotiate treaties in their native tongues, a rare and powerful skill for a queen in a male-dominated world. From an early age, it was clear Cleopatra wasn't just destined to wear the crown. She was born to command it. But her rise to the throne wouldn't come easily. Cleopatra's royal bloodline may have guaranteed her access to the throne, but her path to power was anything but smooth. Egypt, by the time she was a child, was hanging by a thread. The once glorious empire had become a fragile puppet, torn between internal decay and the tightening grip of Rome. In 58 BC, when Cleopatra was just 11 years old, her father, Ptolemy Boci, suffered a devastating blow. His brother, ruler of Cyprus, was accused by Rome of supporting piracy in the Mediterranean. Rather than face humiliation, Ptolemy of Cyprus committed suicide, but this only deepened the discontent in Egypt. The people had grown tired of the Ptolemaic dynasty's weakness and corruption. With the economy in free fall and national pride bruised, the citizens revolted. Ptolemy the Fiend was overthrown and forced into exile, dragging young Cleopatra with him. They fled to Rome, seeking refuge. There, they found shelter in the villa of Pompey the Great, one of the most powerful Roman generals and a member of the First Triumvirate, a secret alliance of Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. The 3 men were plotting to dismantle the Roman Republic and crown themselves as rulers of a new Roman order. It was a dangerous time to be in the heart of Roman politics, but also a golden opportunity. It was in Pompey's household that Cleopatra first encountered Julius Caesar. She was still a child, but this brief meeting would set the stage for one of history's most legendary love stories. With Pompey's backing and the military support of Aulus Gabinius, the Roman governor of Syria, Ptolemy IV launched a return campaign. In 55 BC, Roman forces invaded Egypt and deposed Queen Berenice IV, Cleopatra's older sister, who had taken the throne during her father's exile. There was no forgiveness. As soon as Ptolemy reclaimed power, he ordered Berenice and her allies executed. Bloodlines meant little when power was at stake. Cleopatra, still a teenager, stood witness to this brutal restoration of royal authority. Alongside the returning army was a rising Roman officer named Mark Antony. He had been one of the many soldiers in Gabinius's campaign, and legend has it that this was the first time he saw Cleopatra. She was just 14, but Antony later claimed that even then she had bewitched him. With her father restored and the Roman debts piling up, Cleopatra saw firsthand the price of royal favor. Egypt was no longer sovereign. It was indebted to Rome, and her father had borrowed heavily to buy back his crown. Trade deals with East African and Indian kingdoms temporarily stabilized Egypt. But when Ptolemy V died in 52 BC, he left behind more than a throne. He left Cleopatra with crushing debt, bitter rivals, and a kingdom constantly teetering on collapse. And yet, she took the reins without hesitation. The Ptolemaic dynasty was as much a story of internal decay as it was of external conquest. At its core lay a twisted tradition, one that Cleopatra herself could not escape: intermarriage. To preserve the royal bloodline, brothers and sisters married routinely. Cleopatra was almost certainly the product of such a union, likely born of her father, Ptolemy IV, and his sister, the elusive Cleopatra Tryphena, a woman lost to most of history. It was a custom rooted in ancient Egyptian belief, but in practice, it seeded generations of paranoia, rivalry, and violence. When Ptolemy the Thean died in 52 BC, Cleopatra was named co-ruler alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy the Phaeton. He was just 11. Though technically equal in title, Cleopatra was the true leader, sharp, multilingual, politically savvy. She made the decisions. Her face appeared alone on coins. Her name graced royal decrees. And that, her brother and his advisors could not tolerate. What began as silent tension exploded into a vicious power struggle. By 48 BC, Ptolemy XIII and his regents had had enough. They launched a political coup, pushing Cleopatra out of Alexandria. Once again, she was exiled, first to Thebes, then to Roman-held Syria. But Cleopatra was not a woman who accepted defeat. From exile, she built an army, forged new alliances, and prepared for war. Meanwhile, her family turned into enemies. Cleopatra's younger sister, Antony IV, seized the moment to claim the throne for herself. The siblings' rivalry spilled into open civil war. Egypt, already weakened by years of Roman influence and internal misrule, was plunged into chaos. 3 children of the same bloodline were now at war over the same crown. Yet Cleopatra, alone in exile, still held the sharpest weapon of them all, her intellect. And with Rome's power looming larger every day, she knew exactly where to turn to tip the scales in her favor. She would gamble her future on the ambitions of one Roman general, Julius Caesar. By 48 BC, the fate of Egypt, and Cleopatra herself, was hanging in the balance. Cleopatra, now in her early 20s, was locked in a brutal civil war against her brother Ptolemy III and her sister Antony IV. Exiled and outnumbered, she knew that brute force alone wouldn't win back her throne. If she wanted to reclaim Egypt, she needed a greater power behind her. She needed Rome. At the same time, Rome was battling its own internal war. The first triumvirate had collapsed. Crassus was dead, and Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great were locked in a bloody struggle for control of the Republic. Pompey, once Cleopatra's family ally, was on the run after a crushing defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. Hoping for sanctuary, he turned to Egypt, believing he still had friends there. He was wrong. Ptolemy III, desperate to impress Caesar and gain Roman favor, made a cruel, calculating decision. He invited Pompey ashore under the guise of safety, then had him murdered before he ever reached land. His head was severed, preserved in a jar, and presented to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria days later. But Caesar wasn't pleased. Whether out of political disgust or genuine moral offense, Caesar condemned the act. He ordered Ptolemy and Cleopatra to settle their civil dispute peacefully. For Cleopatra, this was her moment, her opening. What happened next has become one of history's most legendary entrances. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters inside a rolled-up rug carried by her loyal servant Apollodorus. When the fabric unfurled, Cleopatra emerged, not just as a queen in exile, but as a force of nature. Her intelligence, charm, and fluency in Caesar's language captivated him instantly. What began as diplomacy quickly turned into romance. The alliance was sealed not with a treaty, but with passion. Caesar, now emotionally and politically invested, imprisoned Ptolemy III and attempted to appease the remaining sibling, Antony IV, by offering her and another brother a joint rule in Cyprus. But peace was never an option. Ptolemy escaped, joined forces with Antony, and laid siege to Alexandria. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped inside the royal palace, besieged but not broken. Amidst the chaos of war, Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's child. She would later give birth to a son and name him Caesarion, Little Caesar, a living symbol of her bond with the most powerful man in Rome. Eventually, Caesar's reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy the Thene was killed, reportedly drowned in the Nile. Arsinoe was captured and exiled. Cleopatra had triumphed, but tradition still demanded she share the throne. To preserve royal formality, she married her even younger brother, Ptolemy, who served as little more than a ceremonial co-ruler. But Cleopatra no longer needed anyone beside her. She had Caesar. She had her son. She had her throne. And for a brief moment, she had peace. Cleopatra had won back her kingdom, but she wasn't satisfied with merely ruling Egypt. She had returned to the throne with Julius Caesar's help, secured her place beside her child co-ruler Ptolemy XIV, and given birth to Caesarion, a son she boldly claimed was the child of Caesar himself. For Cleopatra, this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a calculated step in transforming her image from queen to goddess. After securing Alexandria, Cleopatra and Caesar embarked on a luxurious cruise along the Nile, an extravagant celebration of their victory. Aboard a massive, state-of-the-art barge adorned with shrines, dining halls, and lavish quarters, they sailed through Egypt as if they were deities on parade. The Egyptian people saw their queen not just as a ruler, but as a divine figure, the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. But even as Cleopatra basked in adoration, Caesar's time in Egypt was drawing to a close. His responsibilities in Rome called him back, and with unfinished wars, a wife waiting at home, and political enemies circling, he departed in late 47 BC, leaving behind Cleopatra, her infant son, and the fragile hope of an Egyptian-Roman alliance, through blood. Determined to solidify her influence in Rome, Cleopatra journeyed to the capital in 46 BC. With her came Caesarion and her considerable wealth. She stayed in Caesar's villa, not far from the heart of Roman power. A golden statue of Cleopatra was even erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix, casting her in the image of the goddess of love, an audacious move that did not sit well with many Romans. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged Caesarion as his heir, Cleopatra pushed the narrative that her son was the rightful continuation of Caesar's bloodline. It was a bold and dangerous claim, especially in a city already suspicious of foreign influence, particularly from a queen who dared meddle in Roman succession. Then came the Ides of March, 44 BC. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by senators, who feared he was becoming a tyrant. With his assassination, the carefully constructed Tower of Alliances Cleopatra had built in Rome collapsed. She was suddenly a foreign queen, unwelcome and alone in a city that had lost both its leader and its patience for Eastern royalty. She fled Rome with haste, returning to Alexandria. If she had any doubts that her political ambitions had died with Caesar, she buried them along with her brother Ptolemy XIV, allegedly poisoned on her orders. With him gone, Cleopatra installed her young son, Caesarion, as her co-pharaoh. She had no interest in sharing power with anyone else ever again. Meanwhile, Rome once again spiraled into civil war. Two powerful figures emerged from the chaos: Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, and his loyal general, Mark Antony. Together, they defeated Caesar's assassins and divided Rome's empire between them. But just as before, Cleopatra was about to step back into the storm. By 41 BC, the Roman world was split in two. Octavian ruled the West. Mark Antony, Caesar's once trusted general, held power in the East. Though the two men had formed a temporary alliance, tension crackled beneath the surface. Each sought dominance, and both needed resources to support their armies. Mark Antony, preparing for a military campaign against the Parthian Empire, turned his eyes toward Egypt. He needed funding, and Cleopatra had it. The queen was now one of the wealthiest women in the world. Her trade routes flourished, her treasury overflowed, and her strategic control of the Nile made her a vital player in Mediterranean politics. Antony summoned her to meet him in the city of Tarsus, a Roman stronghold on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. But Cleopatra was no supplicant. She delayed her arrival, ignoring Antony's requests. When she finally did set sail, it wasn't to plead, but to conquer. Her barge floated up the Cydnus River like a vision from legend. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra arrived dressed as the goddess Venus. Her ship's sails shimmered, purple in the sun, silver oars dipped rhythmically into the water, and music, flutes, lyres, harps, rose into the air. Perfumes and incense wafted across the shoreline. Servants dressed as cupids fanned her, while Cleopatra reclined under a golden canopy, watching the crowds gather in awe. The message was clear. She was no mere mortal. She was divine. Mark Antony was mesmerized. What followed was not just seduction. It was strategy. The two feasted for days, trading flirtations, stories, and political ideas. Cleopatra dazzled him with her wit, her command of languages, and her unparalleled ability to manipulate power while cloaking it in charm. Antony, once the hardened Roman general, found himself disarmed. Before long, he followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria. What was meant to be a diplomatic visit turned into an extended holiday, with Antony indulging in feasts, games, and pleasures fit for a pharaoh. As Plutarch later wrote, Antony squandered away in enjoyment that most costly of all valuables, time. But Cleopatra wasn't merely enjoying herself. She had ensnared one of the most powerful men in Rome. Her influence over Antony grew with every passing day. And in the background, the foundation of a new dynasty was quietly being laid. Behind the opulent walls of Cleopatra's palace, love and politics danced hand in hand. Though Antony and Cleopatra's relationship began with passion and play, it quickly evolved into something far more calculated. Cleopatra understood the stakes. With Caesar dead and Rome fractured, her survival, and Egypt's, depended on building a new power structure. And Antony was her chosen pillar. But first, there were threats to eliminate. Cleopatra had never forgotten her sister Arsinoe IV, who had once tried to take the throne during the Civil War. Though exiled to Ephesus in Roman territory after Caesar's intervention, Arsinoe remained a living symbol of rebellion. Cleopatra couldn't risk her reemergence. She convinced Antony to act. In a brutal and scandalous move, Antony had Arsinoe executed on the steps of the Temple of Artemis, a sacred sanctuary. The violation of this temple caused outrage, but Antony no longer cared for Roman traditions. He was entangled in Cleopatra's world now. Their bond deepened. In 40 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy, Alexander Helios, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene II. Their names alone were statements of grandeur: Helios, the sun god; Selene, the moon goddess. Cleopatra wasn't just building a family. She was crafting a celestial dynasty. But Antony had unfinished business in Rome. That same year, following the death of his wife Fulvia, Antony sought to ease tensions with his rival Octavian. In a strategic move, he married Octavian's sister, Octavia. The union was political, not emotional, but it enraged Cleopatra. Worse still, Octavia bore him 2 daughters, strengthening Antony's Roman ties. Yet Cleopatra never lost her grip. By 37 BC, Antony abandoned Rome and returned to Alexandria. There, reunited with Cleopatra, they had another child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, named in honor of Egypt's ancient rulers. Their relationship wasn't just a scandal, it was a direct challenge to Roman values. Antony began restoring Cleopatra's influence in the region. He transferred control of several former Ptolemaic territories back to her, including key parts of Phoenicia, Cyrene, and sections of Syria and Lebanon. Cleopatra was no longer just Queen of Egypt. She was becoming Queen of the East. In 34 BC, following Antony's military campaign in Armenia, funded by Cleopatra, they staged a grand procession in Alexandria. It was modeled after a Roman triumph, complete with gold, captives, and spectacle. But instead of honoring Rome, the celebration elevated Cleopatra and her children. Before a massive crowd, Cleopatra appeared dressed as the goddess Isis. At her side stood her children, each crowned, and declared rulers of distant lands. Caesarion was named King of Kings. The twins, Helios and Selene, were assigned territories across Asia and Africa. It was a vision of a new world order, one not centered in Rome, but in Alexandria. The Roman Senate was outraged. Octavian seized on the moment, unleashing a propaganda campaign that portrayed Cleopatra as a sorceress, a manipulator who had bewitched one of Rome's most powerful generals. Stories spread of potions, seduction, and Eastern decadence. The message was clear. Antony had abandoned Rome for a foreign queen and a false crown. And when Antony finally divorced Octavia in 32 BC, all bridges to peace were burned. Rome would have its war. The pageantry in Alexandria had been dazzling. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had crowned their children as monarchs of future empires, with Caesarion declared King of Kings and heir to both Egypt and Rome. But across the Mediterranean, in Rome, the reaction was one of fury, not awe. To the Roman Senate, Cleopatra's grand display wasn't a celebration, it was provocation. Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir, saw his moment. Though his alliance with Antony had already frayed, the so-called donations of Alexandria became the final rupture. To the Roman public, it looked like Antony had given away Roman lands to a foreign queen and her illegitimate children. Worse still, Antony's rejection of Octavia, Octavian's sister, added a deeply personal insult to the political. Betrayal. He had divorced her publicly, humiliating her and dishonoring the bond that had once united Rome's two leading men. Octavian acted swiftly. He unleashed one of the most aggressive propaganda campaigns in Roman history. Cleopatra was cast as a sorceress, a temptress, who had seduced Antony and turned him against his homeland. Pamphlets and speeches depicted her as a dangerous foreign queen, manipulating Roman power for Eastern gain. Antony, once a revered general, was now portrayed as weak, drunk on Egyptian luxury, and enslaved by love. Cleopatra became the villain of every story, accused of witchcraft, ambition, and blasphemy. Roman society, steeped in masculine virtue and wary of Eastern influence, lapped it up. Antony's loyalty was questioned. His Roman identity was ridiculed. Meanwhile, Cleopatra stood her ground. She embraced her image as Isis incarnate, continuing to rule from Alexandria with all the ceremony and authority of a goddess. Her confidence was unwavering, but Octavian's strategy was working. Rome was uniting against her. By 32 BC, the fragile peace between East and West shattered entirely. Octavian seized Antony's will, possibly through illegal means, and read it aloud before the Roman Senate. In it, Antony acknowledged his children with Cleopatra, expressed his desire to be buried in Egypt beside her, and reaffirmed Caesarion as Julius Caesar's son and heir. It was political suicide. To the Senate, this proved that Antony was no longer a Roman. He was a traitor, a puppet, a man prepared to hand Rome to a foreign dynasty. War was declared, not against Antony, but against Cleopatra herself. It would be the final confrontation. One woman against an empire. The clash between Rome and Egypt had reached its boiling point. Indeed, 31 BC, the fate of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and the ancient world they represented, rested on the waves of the Ionian Sea, near the coast of Greece. There, at Actium, the two lovers had gathered their combined naval forces to face Octavian's disciplined, battle-hardened legions. Cleopatra's warships were majestic. Her flagship, the Antonia, bore her signature purple sails, symbolizing royalty and divinity. Together, she and Antony commanded over 500 vessels. But numbers meant little. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, led a smaller yet better-trained navy. Strategy and discipline would win the day. The Battle of Actium was not just a military engagement. It was the symbolic collision of two worldviews: Rome's rising order versus Egypt's ancient dynasty. And by the end of it, the old world was sinking. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and rapidly losing ground, Cleopatra made a bold decision. She ordered her fleet to retreat, her flagship breaking, away from the battle. Antony, torn between duty and devotion, abandoned the fight and followed her. Their fleets, left leaderless, surrendered soon after. The defeat was devastating. The retreat to Alexandria was somber. No more lavish parades, no divine illusions, just fear and the stench of a dying dream. For nearly a year, Cleopatra and Antony tried to rebuild their defenses, but Octavian was relentless. In July of 30th BC, he invaded Egypt, marching triumphantly into Alexandria. The city that had once embodied enlightenment, luxury, and power now stood on the brink of ruin. Desperate, Antony attempted one last stand. When he received false news that Cleopatra had died, he chose death over surrender. Drawing his sword, he stabbed himself in the stomach, an agonizing wound that did not kill him quickly. But Cleopatra was alive. She had locked herself in her mausoleum, surrounded by treasure, preparing for her final act. When Antony's men brought his dying body to her, he bled out in her arms. The man who had once commanded Roman legions now died like a mortal, grieving, broken, defeated. Cleopatra, now alone, tried to burn herself and her fortune with him. But Octavian's men intervened, capturing her before she could complete her final ritual. They gave her time to mourn, time to bury Antony, but they would not let her go. Octavian had plans. He intended to parade Cleopatra through the streets of Rome, a spectacle of conquest. But Cleopatra would not be humiliated. "I will not be led in a triumph," she told him, her voice cold, her pride unshaken, and she wasn't. Shortly after, Cleopatra took her own life. The details remain shrouded in mystery. Some say she let an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, bite her. Others believe she used poison, applied to a small wound she made herself. However it happened, one truth remained. Cleopatra died on her own terms. With her death, a civilization ended. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was quickly captured and executed by Octavian. The remaining children were taken to Rome, paraded through the city she had vowed never to enter in chains. Afterward, they vanished into obscurity, footnotes in history where once they were destined to rule. Octavian claimed Egypt as his own, and soon after became Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra's empire was gone. But her legend, shaped by power, passion, betrayal, and resistance, would echo through the centuries.